Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our series talk today, Iran at the Crossroads. It is such a pleasure to have Farnaz Fassihi, New York Times correspondent, with us today at such a momentous time, really, for Iran, and to give us an idea of, how she's covering this story, how she sees developments unfolding in the country and in the region. Farnaz Fassihi is an Iranian-American journalist and United Nations bureau chief for the New York Times. She also leads the Times Iran coverage. A big part of her work has been focused lately on investigating the shadow war between Iran and Israel in the past few years. Prior to joining the Times in 2019, she was a senior writer and war correspondent for the Wall Street Journal for 17 years based in the Middle East. She covered the wars and uprisings in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Gaza, Israel, Iran, and Lebanon. Her wonderful, wonderful memoir, Waiting for an Ordinary Day, is based on 4 years of, her 4 years of covering the Iraq War and witnessing the unraveling of social life for Iraqi citizens. It is such a pleasure to have you, Farnaz John. I just want to point out that this is a hybrid event, which means that, as you can see, I believe, we have people on Zoom, but we also have a room full of students and staff and faculty at the Middle East Studies Department at the University of Texas in Austin. And we have Professor Andrew Butters present, who has brought his class Reporting the Middle East at the Journalism School to this talk. And just a quick note on procedure: we will start this conversation, and following our conversation of about, let's say, half an hour or so, I will first pass the baton to Professor Butters in the room to see for questions from the room, and then direct us toward questions on Zoom. Hello, Farnaz John. Thank you so much for joining us again here today.
Hello, good morning. It's wonderful to be here with you, Nahijan, Andrew, the wonderful students and faculty in the room and online. Thank you for joining. Look forward to this conversation.
Farnaz, you've been covering Iran for such a long time, more than 2 decades. In fact, that's how we first met when I was also reporting in Iran. And you've had an astounding career reporting all over the region, some of the toughest wars in the region. It's been an incredible period for the region at large. And these past few years have been very, very momentous as well. But, I want to start this conversation with a broader question about your trajectory of, in the more than 2 decades that you have been covering Iran. What have been some of the major sort of transformations that you've seen in the country, socially, politically? What are some broader strokes that you can draw for us as somebody who's covered it so closely for more than 20 years?
Yeah. Well, as you pointed out in the introduction, we're at a very critical and juncture with Iran in terms of its the relationship between the government and its people, who have demonstrated that they want change. Iran in its standing and its place in the region, given all the changes that we've seen and the wars of the past year, and military defeat or weakening of many of its regional allies, and Iran with the United States and over its nuclear deal. So it's a very, I would say, I think this year is going to be a decisive year for Iran in terms of where things go. So I've covered Iran for more than 25 years. First, for the majority of my career on the ground in Iran, the trajectory of reporting Iran has closely mirrored the trajectory of politics in Iran as well. There was a time where I could just fly from my base in Beirut to Tehran spontaneously, go into the Ministry of Culture, get a reporter's permit, and go about doing my work. And gradually that space began to shrink. And, they started arresting dual national reporters. It became difficult for us and risky to operate. Nahid was also based there, and we met there while we were both reporting. And a lot of reporters either left or, including myself, can't easily go back, or it would be very risky. So we're left, and Iran started not giving visas to even non-Iranians, just to particularly to American media. So the space to really figure out what's going on in Iran and be able to report it has become very challenging. I think for many news organizations who might not have staff who speak Farsi or have spent time reporting in Iran or have sources, it's become very challenging. So, I think covering a country, it's never ideal to cover a country from afar. I think the first thing that I learned in journalism school was go there. That was the motto. You just go there, whatever the story is, you have to go and figure out what's going on. And so we have to get creative. And I think social media, Iranians are very much online. That has helped the reporting, the sources that I have built and cultivated over the past 2 decades have helped me lead to new sources or talk to them. So that's basically how we approach covering Iran from afar when we can't go, or I can't go really, or they won't give visas that often to my other colleagues. In terms of where things are in Iran, so we've seen, if we want to look at Iran sort of from the early 2000s, where sort of post the early years of the revolution and the war with Iraq, the country was coming out of this ideological fervor, the revolutionary fervor, and thinking, and the population thinking, okay, well, those sort of ideals that you had are not working anymore, and we want reform. So we saw the sort of the birth of a reform movement with President Khatami in what was elected in 1999, just as a new sort of generation of Iranians and Iranian university students were sort of becoming more vocal about their demands for change. So we went through the reform years where there was a lot of hope. There was a lot of potential for trying to change Iran from within, but the system blocked it. The way that Iran's government is set up is you have an elected, it's like a parallel government. You have the pretense of a republic where there's a president and a parliament that are elected, but for almost every body that comes to power through election, there's a council of clerics that are appointed that supervise the work. So even if people go to polls and pick a president based on an agenda or lawmakers, the appointed clerics can always block it. And that's kind of this tug of war is how things have played out in the past 25 years, where the population has elected presidents that have promised reform, and then once they get into office, they really can't deliver. So there was a period of after reform, the Ahmadinejad years, where things, the conservatives took power. And sort of the tensions with the West started, the tensions over the nuclear file, the tensions over sort of, making statements like we want to eradicate Israel off the map, and just putting Iran on a confrontation course with some regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Europe and the United States. And that eventually led to the 2009 wave of protests, which was really the first, I would say, nationwide demonstrations we saw against the government, where people came together, brutal crackdowns by the government. And from then on, waves and waves of protests with, I would say, 1 year, 2 year intervals, where gradually those demands have also evolved and broadened. They went from, we just want reform, we want the president of our choice, to the Mahsa Amini protests in 2022, where protesters were basically saying, we're done with the Islamic Republic. We want wholesale change. We don't believe that you can deliver reform. We just want to live very differently. So I think back to your question, John, of where we are now, we are at this juncture where the system is not meeting the majority of the population's demands and the way that they want to live, and that's where things are internally and politically, I would say.
Thank you so much, Farnaz. John, you mentioned the Mahsa movement, the Woman Life Freedom Uprising, and I definitely want to take us back to that. But before I do that, you just talked about these sort of waves of, attempts by Iranian citizens to bring about reforms through their choice of president. And they really have shown this over and over again by coming to the polls to re-elect Rouhani, and then, sort of giving up, and then Raisi became president, but then once he died in a helicopter crash, again coming out for the, more moderate President Pezeshkian, in comparison at least to the other candidates, say, Jalili, who are super hardcore and would have taken the country on a war path potentially. But these movements have been out of sync with elections and presidents in the US, right? And so when Rouhani really tried for the nuclear deal brokered by the Obama administration, not long after we had the first Trump presidency, and he canceled that deal and instantly imposed extreme sanctions, which derailed any kind of notion for reforms or dialogue or diplomacy for a path forward. And so we had that, and then again, Pezeshkian comes into office. He did win on a campaign of promising to improve the economy, of negotiating with the United States to remove sanctions. And he just had a piece yesterday in the New York Times about how the conservatives are now trying to basically undo those attempts from within the moderate Pezeshkian administration to restart negotiations and to bring about some kind of deal, because the economy is completely in shatters. And so, and then now we have the Trump administration again. I'd like to talk about that a little bit later too. He has signaled that he wants a deal with Iran. And obviously he's aligned himself with Russia, who is an Iran ally. And so I wonder if you can speak a little bit to these currents, both within Iran, these conservative currents that are trying to undermine any kind of growth of reforms or negotiations with the US to improve the economy, as well as, if you can address that, neocon elements within the Trump administration who would try to prevent any kind of talks.
And I think you pointed out to a really critical issue in Iran right now, which is the economy. The President Pezeshkian gave a very candid speech to Parliament on Sunday, where he essentially said the country was bankrupt. He said the government has a massive budget deficit. We can't pay our workers. We can't pay retirees. We can't pay our contractors. They have a massive energy shortage, gas shortage, water shortage, electricity shortage. So the country is faced with huge economic issues. The price of the currency keeps free falling against the dollar. And that is an indicator of inflation. It's an indicator of people's purchasing power. So basically, Iranians are, in a situation where the middle class is shrunk, people are struggling to buy basic goods. Many middle class families have just stopped buying meat or chicken because they can't afford it, and now even some of the other staples like rice have become really expensive. So there's a real economic problem, and this economic problem is actually for when it becomes political, it is mostly affecting the working class and the underprivileged class that the Islamic Republic counts on as its constituents, right? So they are putting pressure on the government that, look, you have to fix the economy. We cannot feed our children. We can't, pay our rent. And How can the government fix the economy? Of course, there's part of that is mismanagement and corruption, but also a big part of that is sanctions. Now when did President Trump exited the nuclear deal in 2018? So now it's about, say, 7, 8 years of sanctions. Now it's starting to show in terms of everyday business of the government, like part of the energy shortage is because of sanctions, because they can't do critical repairs. They don't have outside investors, right? So one way to fix the economy is to negotiate to remove the sanctions, and that requires negotiating with America or negotiating with President Trump. Now, just as there is, a faction of neocons or conservatives in the US that are opposed to any sort of dialogue with Iran. And they think that the way to deal with Iran is to put maximum pressure of sanctions, not negotiate, regime change by any means, even military strikes. There is also a class of conservative hardliners that mirrors this. Inside Iran, where they are very ideological about the approach with the United States. They are very distrustful of the US, and the sort of debacle between President Zelensky and President Trump has really played out in the past week in Iran, where the conservatives are saying, see, look at the way that Trump is treating its allies. Look at the way that relying on America, look where it gets you. We can't trust them. We can't go talk to them. So there's that. There's basically a big faction, which is very powerful in Iran, that wants to oppose this. So this puts the government, the current government, the president, and in a very difficult position, because it came to power promising economic improvement, promising negotiations, but it's now being blocked. And it's being blocked not just by conservative parliaments, but by the ultimate power in the country, who's the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. He came out and said, it's unwise to negotiate with Trump, and anyone who negotiates with Trump is stupid. And the president, interestingly, kind of tried to distance himself from this position on Sunday in his address to the parliament. He said, I've always believed in negotiations. I promised negotiations when I ran. I want to negotiate with America, but Ayatollah Khamenei is not allowing me. So I have to go by what he says, right? So he basically articulated something that everybody knows, which is the ultimate decider is the supreme leader, and the president and the government execute his orders. He just basically said it publicly. So Iran now has to decide, what does it want to do? Can it really weather this economic crisis? Can it weather the power and energy crisis? And what if that leads to more protests? What if that leads to an uprising by the working class and its own constituents? These are all big, real challenges. And also, if you don't negotiate over the nuclear deal, Iran's nuclear program is advancing at record speed. In fact, the UN's atomic agency yesterday said in a report that Iran has more stockpiles of uranium now than any non-nuclear state, right? So if you're not a nuclear state, why are you stockpiling uranium at this rate? And the Iranian officials, very senior officials, have very openly said that, look, we've never wanted to militarize our nuclear program. We've always said it's for peaceful purposes, but if we feel an existential threat, we might actually change our policy and our doctrine and militarize, right? So they've put that out. And that kind of standoff with the United States is going to potentially invite military strikes by Israel, military strikes on nuclear facilities by the US, and then what, right? So that's why, as we pointed out, this is a very critical year. This is the year where Iran is at crossroads. What does it want to do? Does it want to solve its problems and move along, or does it want to stay entrenched in these ideological principles that is basically, putting so much pressure on both the regime and the people?
Thank you so much. I think this is, the Pezeshkian's speech to parliament was in fact quite astounding, because everybody knows that the supreme leader has such a big role to play in the decision making of the country, but then to come out and say it bluntly and to basically try to deflect any kind of responsibility on his administration for these talks not going forward was unprecedented in that direct way. And I think, you brought in obviously a very important element, and perhaps it's a good moment to sort of swerve toward the question of the role of Israel since the Gaza war. Obviously Israel and Iran have had military tit for tats, but then within a matter of 6 months, Israel has taken out, Ismail Haniyeh in July 2024, Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader in Lebanon, in September of 2024, Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas military leader, in October of 2024. Ismail Haniyeh actually was assassinated in Tehran, which is, incredible for, if you consider what that act is in the Islamic Republic itself, and the influence that Israel could actually exert on Iranian ground. And then, of course, the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria in December 2024. So within short order of less than 6 months, Iran's so-called axis of resistance has been eliminated. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how this might impact the kind of decision making that you were just talking about in Iran, right? Whether to go forward with negotiations or open up or close down and really prepare for war.
So, although I always say that I've been covering the Middle East for over 20 years and covered many of these wars from the ground, but I don't remember a year as consequential and spectacular in every country, almost every country in the Middle East, as last year, right? From the war in Gaza to the events in Lebanon and Iran's military tit for tat with Israel, Yemen, like Iraq, everywhere, and then culminating in the fall of Bashar Assad. It was a very consequential year for the Middle East, but particularly for Iran, right? So Iran had sort of backed, supported, funded, armed nurtured these militant groups, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shia groups in Iraq post-Saddam Hussein, Houthis in Yemen, and set up a base, sort of a major regional base in Syria, where it had free reign. In Syria, they controlled military bases, airports, a major shipping port, multiple warehouses, missile factories, and basically it was kind of like, imagine like the role of CENTCOM for American military in the region. Iran had that in Syria, right? So it was really its regional presence from which it directed its network of militant groups. Part of this setup in Iran's mind was creating sort of a forward defense for itself, right? Where it had, and also Hamas, I should say Hamas in Gaza, where it thought that these groups, chief among them Hezbollah, were there to defend Iran if it came under attack. And this was a leverage that Iran played when negotiating with the US or with the West, that look, if you, as part of the negotiations, I can sort of like decrease or increase, the pressure and the activities of these groups. And all of that careful nurturing, sort of, it lost all of that remarkably to telling these groups to open fronts against Israel because of Hamas. And Hamas was an ideological ally. It wasn't sort of a critical military ally the way that Hezbollah was, right? So by thinking that it can increase pressure on Israel by activating all these fronts at the same time against Israel. We saw Houthis firing, basically closing down the Red Sea or the shipping there, international shipping, firing missiles and drones at Israel, Syria, Hezbollah, all of that. But it ended very badly for Iran. It ended with most of its allies taken out, or severely weakened, of losing its major base and sort of operating center in the Middle East in Syria. And having lost those leverages, now it's left with very little to negotiate with the US and very little cards to play, right? So now it has to only rely on its own defense, right? Because given the way that Israel decimated Hezbollah, Lebanon, Gaza, even if these groups rebuild and regroup, they're not going to likely go to war again very soon, because they know that their own populations don't want to keep experiencing this level of destruction over and over for an ally, right? And also Iran, as we said, has financial problems right now. It doesn't have the riches to rebuild Lebanon the way that it did in 2006, to just keep sending millions and millions to the region. So its hands are also constrained in its soft power in the region. And I think that we're going to that. You would think that that might factor in, Nahijan, with decision makers in Iran, but we've seen from speeches of Ayatollah Khamenei where he's still, at least publicly speaking, as if they're going to go retake Syria and rebuild, what they had before last year. But we've also seen a lot of public discourse by pundits, by Revolutionary Guards commanders, even publicly, Iranian media coming out and saying, what are we doing? Like, what was this for? Why did we spend all these millions of billions of dollars on these militant groups? We should focus on our own country, our own people, and building alliances with governments in the region, not militant groups. So even internally now, there is anger and a lot of demands of accountability on the regime about these policies that have so spectacularly backfired.
That's been a really fascinating discourse to watch, actually, internally, as you said, including, Basiji networks coming forward and saying, what are we doing? And maybe we need to rethink these policies. Before I take it sort of backward, because I do want to talk about the Women, Life, Freedom movement, because you did such wonderful reporting on it. But before I do that, and since we're on the topic, I would like to just ask you a little bit about the Gaza war. You mentioned the Lebanon and, this axis of resistance. And of course, there's been this recurrent chant in Iranian demonstrations for many, many years, even going back as, the 2009 Green Uprising of Na Gaza, Na Lubnan, Janam Fadai Iran, not Gaza, not Lebanon. I dedicate my life to Iran, as in like, stop funding these places. How has the Gaza war really played out in Iran? And if you could offer potentially some regional context, comparative context to other populations.
So in Iran, support for the Palestinian cause has been a regime cause, right? It's been something that the Islamic Republic has adopted as one of its main causes and principles. They have a Quds Day every year where regime supporters come out and protest. There's a replica of the Haram al-Sharif in Iran, and lots of talks about liberating Jerusalem and whatnot. So for the average Iranian, the Palestinian cause is something that their government was pushing and advocating for. And while I think that because of the humanitarian suffering in Gaza and what we've seen happen there, tragically, a lot of course, Iranians sympathize, but we haven't seen the level of massive big protests that we've even seen in America in Iran, right? So in Iran, even to the extent that we've seen protests in support of Gaza, they have been limited and small and limited to diehard regime supporters who, occasionally would go out to a square called Palestine Square, where there's actually a digital billboard counting down the numbers to which Iran's going to liberate Palestine and take over, destroy Israel. And I don't know how they came up with it, but there's a digital countdown there. So it's that the discourse of the population with the Palestinian cause has been through the regime. So many ordinary Iranians like to separate themselves from anything and everything that the regime supports, and that has included the Palestinian cause.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, when the Woman Life Freedom Uprising was happening, I'm thinking of the wonderful profile that you wrote of the human rights activist Narges Mohammadi. And you actually managed to interview her in prison. The article was published in June 2023, and she ended up winning the Nobel Peace Prize just a few months later in October of 2023. So that was, an incredible sort of journalistic coup to get to have that profile of her. And of course, she, some of the most prominent sort of leaders of the Woman Life Freedom Uprising have seen that uprising as being intersectional and as opposing all kinds of repression. And so we've seen among those women, for example, and the women, Niloufar, the women who were imprisoned for their photographs of Mahsa Jina Amini, them coming out and expressing their support for the Palestinian people, but really separating that from sort of the regime ideological cause. And can you speak a little bit, when I saw that interview and the fact that you managed to speak with her from prison or get recordings, I suppose, to your questions from prison, it is quite astounding. And I wonder if you can, especially for the journalism students in the room, and we will turn up to questions in a few minutes, if you could speak to this, seeming contradiction whereby the regime is very repressive and can be brutal when it comes to repressing dissent and opposition, killing its own children, so to speak, right? More than 50 of them in the course of Women Life Freedom Uprising were below the age of 18, of the more than 500 people that it killed. And yet, we see Narges Mohammadi, who's able to have these interviews. Nasreen,
Today,
exactly. Nasreen Sotoudeh. Also, she had an interview with Christiana Mampour from prison. I mean, can you speak to these contradictions of the Iranian system a little bit?
So there's a joke in Iran that people say we have freedom of speech, we don't have freedom of after speech, right? So unlike a lot of repressive regimes, Iranians love to talk, and they're not scared. You can sit in a taxi, in a kind of a shared taxi. There's something in Iran called shared taxi, where everybody gets into one taxi and shares a ride. And inevitably, there will be a political discussion. People very freely opine about different things, and they don't seem afraid. So it's easy. It's always, I think, for foreign correspondents visiting Iran, it's always surprising how willing and freely people are speaking their minds. So there's always been this contradiction where people just talk and they stand up for their values, and then they pay the consequences. And this has sort of become part of the discourse of modern Iran, dating even back to the days of the Shah, right? Where there was always like political groups, students, activists, and also post-revolution that are constantly challenging the status quo very publicly. And so Narges is one of them. I interviewed Narges. I was able to interview Narges in prison because I have a long relationship with her, right? Like I've known her for 20 years. When I would go to Iran, I would go visit their human rights center. I talk to her regularly. I'm also in touch very regularly with her husband, Taghi Rahmani, who's a a very well-known political activist, right? So it's, again, going back to those connections that I had made over many years of covering Iran, right? I thought I wanted to profile Nargis because I was, she sort of symbolizes this courage that Iranian women have in a moment where the women are like leading the uprising. They are sort of leading the charge for change, starting with something as simple as their hair, which really isn't about hijab. It's just about having agency over your body, and it's about telling the regime that, look, what I wear is very basic human rights. And if you can't tell me what to wear, you can't tell me what to do. And that sort of extends forward to all the other rights, political rights, all sorts of other rights that people are fighting for, and particularly women. So that's how the interview with Nargis came about. And, it wasn't like Nargis has a phone in prison that I could just call and speak. It was very interesting. I won't discuss it publicly because I don't want to get her in trouble, but it was through a very intricate planning around phone calls that she was able to make. And, I was speaking to her, interviewing her, talking to her when she was in prison. And I told her I missed her and I hope to see her. And then she said my name, right? Because these phone calls are being monitored, right? So she suddenly said, Farnaz, I can't wait for you to come back like the old days, and we will do this and we will go here. And as soon as they figured out who she was talking to, two guards approached her, grabbed the phone from her and slammed it down. And so that was, and then our conversation went dead. So that's the kind of, so she was, even in talking to me, she was taking a major risk from inside a prison cell to get her voice out. And I was elated when she won the Nobel Peace Prize. I think it was such a validation, Nahid, for and recognition, I think, by the international community that change will come to Iran from inside Iran, that the real leaders of the movement for change are people who are living in Iran and are really advocating change there in a very grassroots way. Yeah.
That's really wonderful. And you speak about sort of, these are people who've really been active for, decades doing that kind of grassroots work. I'm conscious of the time, and I want to leave some time for, at least 20 minutes for everybody else to chime in. But I really would be remiss if I didn't just ask you a question. There's just so much happening that, I could talk to you for 5 hours about all of this, but I do need to ask you a question about how you see the Women, Life, Freedom uprising unfolding in Iran more than 2.5 years later. We see images from Iran that are truly astounding. I mean, I cannot, so many photos that you see coming from Iran, are with women who don't just not have a hair cover. They're just dressed as they would be anywhere else, right?
Midriff tops, teenagers walking around with midriff
crop tops, right? Right.
Exactly.
And so, not that this is all that they fought for,
no,
but this
I know.
was sort of, one of the choice over your bodily attire, the choice to have bodily autonomy is intertwined with other choices of freedom and liberty. And so, can you speak a little bit? Does it go beyond that, beyond what we see sort of in terms of dress on the streets, the kinds of freedoms that women fought for, people at large fought for? Have they gotten more than that? Or that's a very visible sort of expression of what they won. But do you think that goes deeper in society, in Iranian politics? How has it really affected the different layers of society, this movement and the consequences?
Well, I mean, I think that the Women, Life, Freedom movement that we saw erupt into public space in 2002 with the killing of Mahsa Amini was really built on decades of a women's rights movement that is a century old. I mean, Nahid as a historian knows, so the first women's rights groups happened in early 20th century in Iran. So it's sort of built on years and years and years of grassroots work that people like Nargis, like Shirin Ebadi, like Nasrin had done, right? To just bring the idea of you should ask for more rights. And it's not just about hijab, but also the right to divorce, the right to child custody, the right to equal inheritance, all sorts of little rights for women that were done in a very grassroots kind of activism for years in Iran, right? And also this younger generation that are very savvy digitally. They're connected to the rest of the world. They watch satellite TV shows. They have Instagram, and they just see themselves as more global citizens, not as citizens of the Islamic Republic. And they have sort of conquered the first space, which is their family, right? And this is the critical change that we're seeing. We're seeing that even daughters of very conservative families going to their parents and saying, I don't think like you do. I'm not going to wear the hijab. I'm not going to fast. I'm not going to just take whatever you say as face value. I'm going to challenge it. And the parents sort of, trying to accommodate and understand that. And we see that going from sort of familial level to societal level, right? And exploding in the Masa Amini movement. The movement of 2020, I call it an uprising because I think it was more than a protest. It didn't quite reach a revolutionary state because it didn't, topple the regime, but it was a real uprising. And it was happening in a very leaderless ad hoc way, right? Like there wasn't a leader saying, come out at this hour on this street. People in different neighborhoods, in different cities, big and small, were just organizing themselves, organizing to go chant death to the dictator, freedom, democracy from the roof. At night, or organizing to come out and sort of, set on fire their scarves and dance in the streets and what. The government brutally cracked down. They killed over 500 people. They arrested something like thousands and 10,000 people. They even targeted teenagers and children. Killing two, the Nikasha Karami and Sarino, two 16-year-olds that became sort of another face of the movement. So the crackdown was very, very severe, and the protests fizzled because of that crackdown after about 6 months. But they sort of ushered in a new era, I think, which is collective civil disobedience, as women as the examples, because the women of Iran sort of just collectively decided, we're just not going to put up with this anymore. We're going to dress as we like. We're going to go out on the streets wearing whatever we like, our hair however we like. And if we stick together and our numbers are too many, you can't do anything about it. And that has become the reality on the ground now, right? So every Iranian woman who decides to wear whatever they want or dress and steps out of the house, which something that we in a free society take for granted, is exercising an act of civil disobedience, right? And they have inspired men to support them, to respect them. They have inspired Iran's storied cinema to get rid of censorship laws. We've seen sort of a movement of underground filmmakers that are making movies like the one that was nominated for Oscar, the Sacred
Seed of the Sacred Fig.
The Seed of the Sacred Fig, which I recommend everyone watch. And My Favorite Cake, sort of, they're influencing things also politically. We saw for the first time the topic of hijab become a campaign issue during the presidential elections, where these conservative, everybody was competing with each other, the presidential candidate, including the conservatives, forced to say, we're not, we don't want forced hijab because they wanted the women's vote. Because the issue of hijab is no longer just the issue of the seculars, that religious women are also standing up and saying, we don't want to force our beliefs on anybody else. We don't approve of what you're doing, right? Mm-hmm. So I think in that sense, it has really transformed Iran's society, and with lasting effects, I think.
Such a wonderful response to the question. Thank you so much, Farnaz John. It has been called, the world's potentially first feminist uprising or revolution, and it's truly, truly astounding what women are able to accomplish through their act of collective civil disobedience. Farnaz John, I'm going to turn to the room with Professor Butters over there to see if he or the people present at the Middle East Studies Department have a question for you, and then we'll come to the Zoom participants.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Siamjoost. I know some of my class has to leave soonish, but before I saw some questions. Can I just quickly jump in and ask Farnaz if she talked for a moment about what it's like been covering this for you personally? I know that you've been on the receiving end of a lot of criticism from like all different kinds of groups who are around this issue, particularly those that want to see military action against Iran. Some of them Iranian-Americans who want that, and I just wanted to ask you if you could share what it's been like on the receiving end of that.
So, as a journalist, Iran is a very, very heated, polarizing space, right? Both inside Iran and outside. And I think when you try to approach this covering Iran in a very professional way, in a way that you're not, taking an activism stand and covering the nuances, it invites just unfortunately a lot of not just criticism. Criticism is, as journalists, I think we should always be open to civic discourse and civic criticism, civil criticism about our work. But unfortunately, in the Iran space, that hasn't been the case. It's been, threats from the government side, threats calling me a spy, and threats against my safety. I mean, I haven't been able to go back to Iran in many years because because of specific threats by Iran's government and sort of the intelligence apparatus, putting on the front page of the government paper that she's a CIA spy and that sort of thing. And from the opposition and some people in the diaspora, a mirror kind of attacks of expecting a journalist to be a mouthpiece, right? And it comes back to, for journalism students in this room, that's where you have to really stand your ground. And it's difficult. I think that I'm lucky that I work for a major media institution that has the resources to support me. I think for freelancers, that's very hard to deal with, both from a security perspective or legal perspective and whatnot. But it's basically that. It's basically interest groups, whether they are opposition groups, whether they are activists, whether it's the Iranian government and its intelligence apparatus, expecting a journalist to be their mouthpiece, right? And say what they want you to say. And if you don't say it, then they mobilize to harass you. I've received death threats, rape threats. I mean, there's a statement pinned to my Twitter from the New York Times denouncing these things, so it's public, from the opposition as well, unfortunately, in a very violent way, in a very sexualized way, doxing my home address, for example, with calls to come and find me and kill me. Only because I refuse to be anybody's mouthpiece and do my work professionally, right? So some of it, I think, goes back to media illiteracy, or maybe people not understanding the difference between an activist and a professional journalist. Some of it just goes back to, the lack of civic discourse, unfortunately. Yeah. So that has been, so it's been not been easy covering Iran, I think, for anyone in the Iran space, and it's not just me, it's also a lot of people in academia, people who are working for think tanks, have to deal with a lot of this nonsense.
Thank you so much for speaking to that and to all the
So much,
challenges.
Farnaz. I have to teach another class next, and some of my students have to go. But can we just go ahead? I know there was a question over there, and
Sure.
maybe some others.
Hello, sorry, I don't know if you can see me. I'm Drew. I'm a student here at Middle Eastern Studies Economics, and thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us. It's been super thought-provoking, so just thank you in general. But my question is, with this kind of backdrop you've mentioned of conservative forces in the Iranian government and general distrust within Iran of the U.S. government, Israel's kind of emboldened stance, and Iran's diminished proxy networks, how do you describe the split within the U.S. government of those who would prefer strikes on Iran's nuclear capabilities and those who prefer negotiations? How do you kind of see the split within the U.S. government and then maybe the Israeli government also?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, you know, traditionally, I mean, what we've seen in the past few years has been democratic administrations favoring more a diplomatic course, while Republicans taking a harsher stand on Iran. But with President Trump, he's been very clear that he prefers diplomacy, and he wants to see a nuclear deal and not necessarily military strikes in Iran, and that's been interesting. So while at the same time he signed an executive order for his maximum pressure policy, which is sort of enforcing sanctions and whatnot. So the forces within, I think, as we mentioned, there are sort of the more neocons who don't, even within the administrations or outside, who will want to sort of push for a harder stand on Iran. But I think that ultimately, if they want to, the diplomatic track appears to be what the administration wants to push, at least first, before it makes any military decisions. Now, they've never taken the option of military out. I think multiple times where reporters have asked Mr. Trump if he's considering military, he said, "I'm not going to talk about that publicly." But he has, I think even Secretary Ruby, they have said, we're not pursuing regime change in Iran. And that's something that, the neocons and sort of the opposition forces outside of Iran, it's something that they don't like to hear. They want to push for regime change at any cost, right? One has to look at the history of regime change in the region to see whether that makes sense. The regime change adventures in Iraq, in Afghanistan, did not go at all as planned. So, Iran could be even worse. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Farnaz. John, if it's okay, I will extend the questions to the Zoom room as well. And so if anybody has questions in the Zoom, you can put them in the text, or you can just unmute even if you don't go on camera and ask your question. And if there are any questions from the physical room, please let me know. I think if Professor Butters has to leave, Safi is there and Tyus is there too.
Yeah. Here to help.
Great. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, who is that?
Jonathan, in your Middle East class.
Yep, go ahead.
Ms. Fassihi, thank you for speaking with us today. My question is, in order for Iran to be more prosperous and compete on the world stage, what is the path forward to produce meaningful change within the government? Is it an overthrow of the authoritarian regime and shifting the power towards the people and creating a more democratic republic, or is it something else?
I wanted to make sure that I understood the question clearly. The question was, what's the path forward for Iran to democratic change? Is that correct?
Yes.
It's a very good question, but a difficult question to answer because Iran tends to be very unpredictable. The forces inside Iran, outside Iran tend to be flexible. We've seen that over and over, as Professor Siam just pointed out, that Iranians have demanded change through calling for reform or calling for the government to do this peacefully and listen to them. And that hasn't panned out. But there's also not, at least in Iran or even the opposition outside, a sort of a united opposition against Iran that could lead externally or internally a kind of a revolution that would topple the regime. And we've also seen that the regime is extremely brutal, that it is willing to kill and be very forceful and brutal in order to stay in power. So that makes the prospect of democratic change through sort of in the immediate term very difficult. But what we're seeing is that all of these waves of protests and the discourse are bringing small change. Now it's not happening as fast and as big as the people of Iran want, but I don't think that we have a very clear answer on how this ultimate goal, which is really the demand of the majority of people to have democratic change and freedom, how this is going to exactly come about and at what cost.
Thank you.
Sure.
I had a quick question, if that's okay.
Sure.
So you spoke about the film The Seed of the Sacred Fig, and I saw in the news headlines a few days ago that the woman who played the mother, she's facing jail time, and I believe like 72 lashes by the Iranian government. And I was wondering what you think her fate will be, since we saw last fall, Mashalihi, for his song Surah Mush, he was cleared of his charges for the song that essentially denounced the government.
We just interviewed Sohaila Golestani, the actress, a few days ago for a piece about filmmakers breaking censorship rules and facing consequences. And she is facing trial. The whole cast and crew of the movie, including the director, Mr. Rasulov, and all the main actors and cinematographer, they're all facing trial at Revolutionary Court. And some of the charges against them are just ridiculous, threatening national security, spreading indecency through a movie. And everyone has left Iran except for the lead actress who plays the mom, Sohaila. She is awaiting trial. She could possibly face many years of jail. She has been banned from working or leaving the country or teaching. And these charges also are targeting two other directors, a couple who made My Favorite Cake, which is another wonderful movie. And they're also facing similar charges and similar. So going back, the remarkable thing about Iranians living in Iran is, despite the tremendous risks to their safety, to their well-being, and the tremendous costs that they have to pay, they're still doing it. I think I interviewed Mr. Rasulov last week for the piece, and I asked him, did you guys think about the risks when you did this? And he said, we actually talked about it. We had a very open discussion with the cast and crew, and everyone decided that we wanted to make this political stand. Sohaila, the mom in the movie, told us that when she wanted to play this role, because to her it was more than just playing a role in a movie. It was making a political stand. It was participating in this big social movement that's taking part.
So why is it that she chose to stay in Iran?
She's not allowed to leave. She couldn't, I think she had to stay for personal reasons, and then when she tried to leave, she was banned.
Thank you. That's Elika for that good question. We actually put together an open access digital humanities resource on the Women, Life, Freedom Uprising, and Elika was one of the team members, and that's on archived on Texas Scholar Works.
definitely look it up. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a wonderful resource. Well, Farnaz John, I don't know how to thank you. This has been so incredibly engaging, so wonderful to have you here, give us of your expertise and your insights, spanning 25 years of reporting Iran. It's been a real privilege. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and speak to us.
Thank you very much for having me. Good luck to everybody. And I appreciate speaking with you all. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.